Hello, you're watching BBC News. I'm Karen Giannoni. Pope John Paul II has died. He had been gravely ill since Thursday. He died in bed at his apartment in the Vatican. This is the scene live in Vatican City, where thousands of people have spent the day praying for the Pope. His condition had worsened considerably in the past 24 hours, with severe heart and kidney problems related to the effects of Parkinson's disease. Poland's President Aleksander Kwaśniewski has been speaking about the country's favourite son, who became Pope.
Dzisiaj serca Polaków przepełnione są głębokim żalem.
Today the hearts of Poles are filled with great sorrow and the pain of loss of someone close, a friend and spiritual guide whose energy and strength of faith and extraordinary power of conviction were the source of our joint hope.
Ale jest w nas też duma, że z polskiej ziemi
There's
zrodził
also pride that the Polish land gave birth to one of the most outstanding people in modern history. That centuries of exceptionally deep spirituality in our nation gave birth to an outstandingly beautiful individual who was able to give so much to the world.
I osobiście czujemy się w tym smutnym dniu szczęśliwi.
Personally, we feel on this sad day happy that we have lived in these times.
Jan Paweł II był wielkim apostołem pojednania.
John Paul II was a great apostle of reconciliation. He contributed to the fall of the Iron Curtain and the expansion of the European Union, through which he helped build cooperation between many countries and give their citizens rights and dignity.
The President of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso, has also paid tribute to John Paul II.
I wish to express my deep sorrow on learning of the death of His Holiness Pope John Paul II. To the Vatican, to the entire Catholic community, the European Commission offers its condolences. I send a special message of solidarity to the Polish nation, which has known in Karol Wojtyła one of its most distinguished sons. John Paul II will be remembered as someone who played an essential role in the unification of Europe and in the advance of the ideas of freedom and democracy in our continent. Europeans will never forget his struggle for peace, for human dignity. I had the enormous privilege of knowing this great European and world figure. His disappearance leaves a void in the hearts of all those believers or non-believers who have been inspired by his example of courage and humanity.
Paul II will be remembered for being theologically orthodox and socially conservative, and for his strict control of the vast church he led. But the Pope won't be remembered simply as an autocratic conservative. He was an outspoken critic of capitalism and materialism, arguing instead for a fairer sharing out of wealth. His spirituality and his background as the first Polish Pope also meant that he meant many different things to Roman Catholics. Our religious affairs correspondent, Robert Piggott, reports.
John Paul II ruled the Roman Catholic Church like a sovereign monarch. Those who visited him, such as the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, paid their respects at what amounted to a court, the centre of power in a global church, including 1 in 6 of the world's population. His death tonight leaves the church with a gaping hole at its heart. The Pope entered the Vatican intending to reinforce what he saw as Roman Catholic orthodoxy. His uncompromising determination to enforce his will has left his successor to confront difficult issues. John Paul has left Catholics with a highly centralised church. The effects of concentrating Catholic power in Rome had their most devastating effect in America. It emerged that in the last 50 years, almost 4,500 American priests had been credibly accused of sexual abuse. American bishops who'd been undermined by years of rule from Rome had lost the initiative to tackle the problem. They tried to cover it up instead. The result has been disastrous damage to the church's reputation and compensation likely to exceed $1 billion.
Even bishops who are normally loyal to the Holy See and never speak a word out of turn have actually been extremely critical about the way in which the department in Rome concerned with the liturgy has treated them.
The next pope will also need to review John Paul's ban on contraception. John Paul became pope before AIDS overtook Africa, But the emergence of the disease did little to dampen his fierce opposition to the use of condoms. He saw contraception as corrupting the ideal of monogamous marital sex. But as the infection rate in Africa has increased, unease has grown among Roman Catholics. Even some cardinals say using condoms is justified if it prevents infection. Some Catholics believe the Pope's hostility to contraception has damaged the Church's standing in the developed world too. John Paul felt that the growing tendency of Catholics to ignore the ban on contraception constituted direct disobedience to him as Pope. That made him determined to enforce the rules. His failure to do so further undermined the Church's authority. The Church faces a third crisis: dwindling numbers of priests and falling congregations. The developed world seems to be losing its faith. In countries such as France, pews are emptying as secular values take over from Christian ones. Few men are being ordained, and the average age of priests is growing. Half of French priests are expected to die in the next decade.
To change this downward trend is going to be an enormous challenge for anybody being elected to succeed John Paul II. I think, in fact, this will be one of the main considerations when the cardinals meet in conclave, how they're going to want to choose someone who might have the vision to change this downward trend in Western Europe.
An abiding memory of John Paul II will be his declining years. In Slovakia in 2003, he was occasionally lost for words. His fading health and reported lapses of memory led to doubts about his ability to manage the world's largest church. Questions were raised about who else might be running the Vatican. In recent months, with John Paul determined to stay in office, anxiety about his fitness increased. As medical science made it possible to extend life, what should be done about a mentally incapacitated Pope? That spectre, apparently avoided this time, is an issue the Church can no longer ignore. John Paul inspired tens of millions with his humanity. Even his public death has been a witness to the Christian faith for which he stood. His conservatism came from a desire to create the conditions where life could flourish and death could not. This most remarkable of men left the post of Pope as the world's supreme moral voice. He's left his successor with an enormous weight of responsibility. Robert Piggott, BBC News.
Well, let's go to Washington now. And Francis Kissling, president of Catholics for a Free Choice, a group supporting sexual and reproductive rights. Francis Kissling, thanks for being with us here on BBC News. Firstly, your thoughts, if you will, on this news from the Vatican.
Well, of course, the first thought is one of a sense of relief that his suffering is now ended, and a sense that a life was well lived, that he had a good death, and that he made an enormous contribution. I also personally felt very sad, as a person who disagreed with him on so many issues, the inability over that entire 26 years for those of us who disagreed to ever get a fair hearing, leaves us with a bittersweet feeling as we move towards the next papacy.
As you say, you have disagreed with many of the Pope's decisions over the years. John Paul II has been described as a great Pope. Is that something that you would agree with?
Oh, yes. I mean, I think one can... I think all individuals, including popes, are complex, and great individuals are especially complex. None of us are freed from contradictions. I think he was a great pope in the way in which he approached the external world, the way in which he was an advocate for the poor, his travels to the developing world, his advocacy for debt reduction. All of those things made him an enormously great pope. At the same time, he was a human being, and the very freedom and the very liberation that he advocated for the third world, he seemed unable to understand was also an integral part of a democratic church.
In a historical sense, will it be his unprecedented popularity as a human being he'll be judged on, or the trickier issues he encountered on certain areas of doctrine?
Mm-hmm. I think he will be remembered for his popularity, but popularity does fade. And ultimately, history looks at people in harsher and perhaps even more objective terms. But I think he will always be remembered as really the first Pope of the age of communications. He had many of the same charismatic qualities that John the 23rd had, who opened the doors of the church to democracy. But John the 23rd did not have 24-hour news media, nor did he have the ability to travel in quite the same way as this Pope did. So he will be remembered for that. But he will also be remembered very quickly for the enormous problems he leaves the church with internally, whether it is married priests, women who want to be priests, parishes who want to control their finances, girls who want to serve at the altar, people with AIDS who want to not die or transmit the disease. These are all very serious social problems that the next Pope must confront.
And looking forward to that next Pope, is there anybody among the possible successors to Pope John Paul II that you would most hope to see as the next resident of the Vatican?
I have to admit that I don't have a favorite candidate. I'm not overly optimistic about the next Pope. After all but 3 of the cardinals who will elect the next Pope were selected by this Pope. So the chances for a conservative, a social conservative, a theological conservative are strong. I do believe that whoever is the next Pope, 10 years from now, we will see married men as priests. And that will be the beginning of the humanization of the Catholic Church in relation to human and sexual relationships.
Okay, Frances Kissling, many thanks for your thoughts.
My pleasure, thank you.
The Pope has been a dominant figure on the world stage for the last quarter century. His death is being felt by people of all faiths and those of no faith too. And the world's Catholic community is now in deep mourning. There are nearly 1 billion baptised Catholics in the world. That's more than 17% of the global population. Nearly half of them live in the Americas, more than 500 million. About a quarter are in Europe, around 280 million. More than 13% live in Africa. That's around 140 million people. 10% of Catholics live in Asia, about 113 million. Less than 1% of Catholics live in Oceania. By the end of 2005, it's estimated there'll be more than 1.1 billion Catholics around the world. Growth is fastest in Africa and Asia. In 2003, the Pope celebrated the 25th anniversary of his papacy. Despite his failing health, he took part in events to commemorate the occasion as pilgrims flocked to Rome.
Pope John Paul's Silver Jubilee was marked by a series of spectacular events. First, there was a Mass in St. Peter's Square. In keeping with the Pope's own request, the personal aspect of the anniversary was played down. But even though it was a solemn rather than a festive occasion, pilgrims came from around the world to celebrate his epic reign.
John Pope the Great, John Pope the Terrific, John Pope the Good, John Pope, any title that conveys his tremendous benevolence.
2 days later, he presided over an exotic set piece, the beatification of Mother Teresa, the nun who devoted her life to the dead and dying on the streets of Calcutta. This rich intertwining of East and West featured Indian dancers, a phial of Mother Teresa's blood, and an audience of more than 300,000.
Her life was a radical living.
In a homily read for the Pope by an Indian archbishop, John Paul called Mother Teresa's life a testimony to the dignity and the privilege of humble service. Mother Teresa's rapid beatification, bringing her to the threshold of sainthood a mere 6 years after her death, is the quickest in the Church's history. To Pope John Paul, she was the ideal Catholic role model. The day was rounded off with a colourful firework display lighting up Vatican City. The Pope viewed the scene from his private apartments. Tellingly, though, his secretary had to gently remind him to bless the crowd. John Paul's tiring series of engagements ended with his presenting red hats or berettas to 30 newly created cardinals.
Al Cardinale Keith Michael Patrick O'Brien.
Among them was the Archbishop of St Andrews and Edinburgh, Keith O'Brien, only the third Scottish cardinal to be appointed since the Reformation. The Pope presided over the service from his wheeled throne. His voice was weak and at times he struggled to speak. These princes of the Church will now decide who succeeds the longest reigning Pope of recent times. Bronwyn Jeffries, BBC News.
The president of the Philippines, Gloria Arroyo, said the Pope had been a spiritual bridge between nations. Well, the BBC's Sarah Toms is on the line now from the capital, Manila. Sarah, what more has President Arroyo been saying?
Well, President Arroyo is really leading the nation in expressing what she calls a deep sense of grief and loss over the death of John Paul. She said he was a holy champion of the Filipino family and of profound Christian values that make every one of us contemplate every day what is moral and just. Of course, the death of Pope John Paul II has united the whole of the Philippines. It's Asia's largest Catholic country. There are 65 million Catholics here. That's 80% of the population. And they are slowly waking up to the news that the Pope is dead. When I went to an early morning mass, most people still didn't even know that he had died. And they were just choked up with emotion. Some couldn't speak to me. Others didn't believe that it was true. So everybody's really in a sense of deep shock here. Filipinos are well known for being optimistic, and they were really praying for some kind of miracle right to the very end.
Sarah, we all remember those extraordinary scenes in Manila during the Pope's visit there, testament, I suppose, to his popularity.
That's right. He visited the Philippines twice, and really he had a very special bond with Filipinos. On his second visit in 1995, he drew crowds of more than 4 to 5 million. It's supposedly the largest ever gathering a Pope has had for Mass. And because of this, he's had a close affinity with the Philippines. Also, the country strictly adheres to the Pope's policies against contraception, against divorce, against homosexuality. There is no divorce in the Philippines. Even in Rome, in Italy, there is divorce. And many religious commentators say Filipinos are more popist than the Pope.
Sarah Toms from Manila, many thanks. Over 13% of the world's Catholics live in Africa. Our World Affairs correspondent Mike Wooldridge asked Cardinal Wilfred Napier, Archbishop of Durban in South Africa, how much of an impact he believed Africa had on Pope John Paul II.
I think a great deal, because of the vibrancy of the faith. The celebrations are obviously celebrations. Wherever he went, it was always a great joyous occasion.
Would it be good for the Church if it had a Pope from Africa, possibly even now?
I suppose wherever the Pope comes from, it'd be good for the Church. For Africa, I'm not so sure that we are there yet, but it would be certainly a breath of fresh air, I would imagine.
And would you expect to be among the contenders?
I don't think so. And you might ask me why. And I would say, knowing myself and knowing what I believe are the things that the qualities that the Pope would need at this time. We need somebody who's a bit of a visionary, who can dream up and see into the distance where the Church needs to go, how it needs to respond, not just react, but respond to some of the situations that have developed. And somebody who's going to continue where Pope John Paul II left off. Concern about the family, he's concerned about youth.